Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's online ISO metadata training series. Today we're going to cover validation. I'm Jackie Mize. I'm at NOAA's National Coastal Data Development Center. We're a division of NODC. If you have multiple people in one location signed on, please email the list of those participants to ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov. Also, if you notice in the chat window, I have put the link to the online materials. We are recording today's session and we'll be posting it as soon as it becomes available. Last week's session, something happened with the recording software, so we will try to re-record that and post that at a later date. If you have any questions, please use the questions box. If we don't get to your question today, I will compile that list and email those out, or you can also email your questions to ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov. The resources we'll be using today, again, all the training materials in the Intro to ISO training. Anytime you see the green information link, if you click on that on the slide, it will take you to that point in the GeoIDE wiki that gives you further information and examples on that topic. And again, the workbooks are found on the FTP in the training materials and also on NCDDC's website. So today we're going to be covering validation, validating the ISO metadata standards. This is going to be a little bit more technical, but as you get used to it and just get some hands-on, it will get easier, and a lot of the tools take care of a lot of the technical validation stuff behind the scenes for you. But I'm going to walk you through the validation process and all the pieces that it takes to have properly valid ISO against the schemas, and we'll go over what those are. So there's several different tools that you need for validation: the schemas, the namespaces, and the Schema Trons. These are three main pieces for validation. And of course, depending on which software that you're using to edit and validate your ISO metadata in, a lot of this will take place behind the scenes for you. All right, XML schemas. Remember when we talked about the ISO 19139? That is what the ISO standards validate against. That 19139 gives all the rules and structures, and those form the schemas. The schema defines the structure, content, and some semantics of XML documents. It's the pattern that represents the data's model and defines the objects, attributes, and relationships. And it defines the rules for the structure and content of an XML document. And for ISO, that is the 19139. The 19115 and the 19115-2, that's more of the documentation. You need these elements documented in this order, but the 19139 is the XML that validates that you can only repeat this one element once, or you can repeat it, it's repeatable, or this element's mandatory. That's what checks those validation things for you, is the schema. All right, so which schema do you use? When you download the schema or look on the FTP, there's a folder full of different schema. There are multiple schema. There's Eden and NGDC are the most used, with NGDC schema being recommended. That's the one that's on the FTP for you to download. There's also a lot of different namespace locations out there. ISO they started them, but they never updated them. In fact, 2001 was the last time that they had updated the schema, so it was community-driven. OpenGIS made some edits and updated them, but the most up-to-date set of schemas out there that are the valid ones are the ones that are maintained at NOAA's National NGDC. Depending on what you're using, which standard you're using, you use a different schema reference. The link here is the one that you should reference to. If you're going to publish a document, always use the online link. But if you're working internally, you might want to download a copy of the schema so that you can work offline and validate that offline just for internal. But when you publish it, you should always use the web schema declaration. And we'll go over that. You need to always, the first step, if you're looking at a metadata record, is to make sure that you have the proper schema associated with it and the proper namespaces. If a record has the root MD_metadata, that's the ISO 19115, then you need to apply the gmd.xsd. That's the one that you're going to point to. That's the one that starts with that root. The MI_metadata root is the ISO 19115-2, and you need to apply the GMI XSD. The feature catalog root, that's the FC_feature catalog, that is found at GFC XSD. And we'll go over where each of those are located. But just know that the different standards that you're validating against, you need to use the proper schema. Also, service metadata, that's SV_service metadata, that's going to use the SRV XSD. And XSD is just the extension for schema. If you use biological, if you're using the biological extensions, make sure that you use the biological schema located on the FTP, and those that works to extend either the MD or MI root. All right, namespaces. Again, we talked a little bit about this, about how you may notice in the XML that the element names have a 3-letter code followed by a colon. Those are the namespaces. An example, GCO, and then character string. These codes are called namespaces, and the namespace is a container providing context and rules for items. A definition of a term may change depending on what namespace is applied. So here's where you sometimes get a little tricky, is where you have to have the correct namespace and schema declarations. They have to be the correct versions. If you have an older version of one and they're not referencing the correct ones with each other, you can get different validation errors, which is why we have set up some validation error guidance for you, which is as simple as this. If you run into a problem with validation, first things first, always make sure you have the proper namespaces and schemas applied. So you'll see at the beginning of every metadata record, it may be GMI MI_metadata, which is the 19115-2, or this also works for the GMD MD_metadata. If it's a GMD, you do not need to use the GMI namespace. You can actually get rid of this one. But by default, it's a good practice just to cut and paste all of these XML namespace declarations for each one of these. These give all the namespaces here and of where to go for those, and there's different version numbers of them too on a couple of them. But if you want, then also the schema location, here's its location here. So these need to be the correct pairing of them, and if you just copy and paste these into the beginning of header of every document, or make sure that every XML document has these, you'll be fine. If you want a full synopsis on the different versions and what's updated in the different ones, you can get more of that information if you click here. One of the big things that I notice a lot is if you run into a problem with time periods not validating, make sure you have that correct GML namespace. See, it's 3.2. That one gets tricky sometimes. So that's always one of the big errors that I see. And if you get a problem where it's not recognizing something, make sure you have the full list of there. If you're missing, if it's saying you're having an error validation with character strings, maybe you don't have, maybe you're missing this namespace declaration. There are lots of issues between the GML namespace and the schema. There are 2 versions of GML schemas. So there's a full synopsis about the rules of having the right declarations. And again, those are found on the wiki and the information here if you want to go into that level of detail. So Schema Trons are used in conjunction with schemas. They check for additional validation that a schema cannot check, such as the west bounding coordinate really is west of the east bounding coordinate. and it also delivers human-readable error messages. You can customize Schema Trons to enforce more constraints. Maybe your organization wants to make certain elements mandatory as best practices, or maybe you want to only allow certain things in a code list, or maybe you want to only allow certain text in certain areas. And after you validate against the ISO schema, the 19139, you can then apply Schema Trons on top of it for additional validation and to enforce best practices. And these are completely customizable. For an example, the North American profile is a profile of ISO. And there are Schema Trons out there where you can actually take a metadata document and apply it and validate it against the ISO standard. And after it passes the ISO validation, then you can apply the NAP Schema Trons on top of it to make sure that it follows the best practices set forth by the NAP. The NAP actually enforces makes a couple of elements that are optional in ISO, makes them mandatory. And so what that does is that Schema Tron will enforce that you're meeting that profile. And you can do that for your organization. If you always want certain elements filled out or filled out in a certain manner, you can customize the Schema Tron to just apply that on top of it to make sure that all your records are enforced in that manner. All right, we're going to walk through a little example. I'm showing you in XML Spy, the two most common tools that we use, XML Spy and Oxygen. Also, GeoNetwork is a nice one with a GUI, a graphical user interface, and it has a really nice validation error messages and all this schema namespace declaration stuff built into the scenes for you, so you don't have to tweak with that. You can just hit validate. But for those of you that want to get in with XML editors, or just so that you're common knowledge of how the tools work, of how they validate, this is what we're going to show you. To apply the schema, first things first, in Altova XML Spy, go to DTD Schema, and then choose the correct schema to apply. Again, use that one from NGDC, that link, and then you just hit OK. In Oxygen, what you do is you go to Document, Schemas, and the associated schema. And then you associate this one from NGDC, that URL. And then you hit OK. And then you have the appropriate namespaces and schemas so that you can start your validation there. So remember, the first things first, whenever you start to validate a document and check its errors, is to make sure you have the right namespace and schema declarations. All right, so here's some FYI that I'll show you. ISO validation FYI, you can go to the GeoIDE wiki. There's a validation error guidance. There's error guidance for both Spy and Oxygen, and it's really nice. I'll show you what it looks like. Here we go. It has the error messages, and it gives you some of the most common error messages that you'll get for when you validate. And what I really like about it is it gives you what the problem is, what's not valid. Here's what the error message gets, because sometimes those error messages, until you get used to reading them, you have no idea what they're saying. So what we try to do is what this really says in English, and then try to walk you through, and then here's how you correct this issue. So I find these wiki pages very useful. And again, these are the links for that there. I will actually paste these in the chat window as well. There's another validation page on the wiki that I'll add to the chat window, the links for it, and it's on that slide. This goes through the whole how to validate ISO metadata, and it talks about the schemas and Schema Trons as well. And it gives you the correct, it goes through all the validation tips with the different versions of namespaces and what you should put in a header. And we showed this slide before. This is the namespace abbreviation table that identifies the namespaces that may be found in the XML that you'll see. You do not need to know exactly what these are, but just make sure that you have the namespace declarations that you'll be using. And again, with that validation document, you'll also have that information right there for you. On the FTP, there is a handouts. If you notice, there's a handouts directory, and there is a schema and namespace cheat sheet and a validation cheat sheet. And that walks you through a lot of, okay, here's what you need for your schemas and namespaces, and then this is some validation errors as well. So there's lots of information out there for you to use. All right, I'm going to walk you through this exercise. It's a metadata to fix, and I'm going to walk you through the metadata to fix 1.xml. And for homework next week, if you would download either SPI or Oxygen or GeoNetwork from the tools that we talked about in the previous weeks, and try to fix the metadata to fix 2. I'll show you where that's at. In the FTP site, there's exercises. We're going to walk through this example right now, and then if you want to do this one at, on your own time, just so that you can get used to it. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this record and we're going to open it in SPI or Oxygen. I'm going to use XML SPI for demonstration purposes. We're going to apply the correct schema, check the namespaces, and then check the validation. So here I have this record open in XML SPI. I see it's an MD_metadata, so that's my 19115. So first thing first, I see I have a header in here with some information, but I want to make sure that it has the correct validation before I ever get started. So what I do is I make sure that I have my schema location using the most valid and up-to-date schemas available for ISO, which are housed here. And then I want to check my namespace declarations. And I see right now that I don't have the correct version number of this one. So I add that, and then I can run my validation. I get a validation error message in here. And it tells me further elements are required under CI responsible party. I can open this up, and it says it's missing role. Well, when you go and look in your workbooks, you'll notice that you need a role. So if you open up, if you go and look in your workbooks, and you look up contact info, so here's contact info. I have CI contact, okay? You know, and it says, what am I missing in contact info or CI responsible party? It says I'm missing something in CI responsible party. So in CI responsible party, okay, I must have one of these, and this is mandatory. Role is mandatory. So that's what that error message told me. Okay, well, let's go back and look at this document. All right, I have my organization name, and again, I close some of these things so I can see what's going on. And I notice, yes, indeed, I am missing a role. And this helps me, my little window over here, because this tells me as I walk through, what am I missing and where. You see that little exclamation point says I'm missing role, and that's mandatory. So I expand this role open, or this contact open, and I come in here and I add my role. You see role's missing, so where role belongs is in between the contact info and CI responsible party tag, closing tag. And that you can find in your workbook. That'll tell you right now that role's under contact info. So I add my role in here, you know, role, and it contains the CI role code, and I add my role code URL. I select from that list which one I want, which is originator, and I put that in there. After I add that, okay, well, let me check validation again. And now I have a valid metadata record. This is valid, and that's all that was missing, was I was missing a mandatory element from the standard. But now I have it in there, and I have a valid XML record now. So if y'all would actually walk through the metadata to fix 2.xml for next week, and we'll go over this validation errors, just so that you can get used to the technical behind the scenes, how things work with validating metadata. Again, if you have any questions, we have a little bit of time to cover some questions now. So let's take a look at some of those. All right, does anybody have any questions that they want to put in here into the questions window? When will the recording from last week be made available? We had a failure with the recording software, and so I will try to record that sometime this week, and I will try to get it up by Friday. I will put today's recording, granted it doesn't fail again, I will put this up later today so that you will see today's recording. All right, any other questions? Did somebody raise their hand? Could they raise their hand again? If you had a question, either raise your hand or use the chat window. All right, the PowerPoint seems to be missing some slides, someone said. I will re-upload this PowerPoint to make sure that the correct one is on there for this afternoon. All right, any other questions right now? Today was a little bit more technical, but don't worry. The more you get your hands involved on it, the easier it will become. It'll become like second nature. When I first started doing this, I was intimidated by a lot of the XML and viewing all of that. But once you actually just start walking through, it'll start making a lot more sense once you get your hands on it. And again, you have all of these resources. You can go back through and walk through. And again, please email ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to walk you through it. Again, there's other GUI-based tools out there like CatMDEdit or GeoNetwork that do a lot of that behind the scenes for you, but you need to know how they do it, how the tools walk you, how the tools actually do a lot of the XML validation behind the scenes. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody were aware of how it actually happens. All right, if we have no further questions, I look forward to seeing y'all next week. Next week is on data discovery. All right, thank you.